Ethan stared out of the bus window as the landscape of small-town America blurred past him. It had been years since he'd seen these streets, but nothing seemed to have changed. The same gas station on the corner, the old diner where people still gathered for coffee, and the small houses lined with white picket fences. Everything looked peaceful, yet Ethan felt anything but peace. The memories of his time overseas clung to him like a heavy shadow, always there, always pulling him back. The hum of the bus engine reminded him of the noise of the military trucks, the constant motion, the never-ending tension. But now he was back home, though home wasn't quite the right word for this place anymore. Ethan shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his hand resting on the worn duffel bag by his feet. His chest tightened as the bus neared his stop. After everything he had been through, the battles, the long nights, the loss, coming back here felt like another fight waiting to happen. The bus came to a slow halt. Ethan grabbed his bag and stepped off, the air around him thick with summer heat. He looked down the street, and there it was, the old house where he had grown up, the place where everything had started to fall apart. He took a deep breath and walked slowly, his boots crunching against the gravel. As he approached the front door, memories flashed in his mind. The laughter of two young boys, the sound of a boxing bell ringing in the backyard, and then the yelling. Always the yelling. His father, Frank, had been a boxing coach, tough as nails and just as unforgiving. Ethan and Jack had spent most of their childhood either in the gym or training in the backyard. But that was before everything went wrong, before Ethan left for the army and Jack turned his back on fighting. As Ethan stood at the door, hesitating, it opened before he could knock. There stood Frank, older now, his face lined with years of disappointment and regret. His once strong frame had softened, and his hands, once so powerful, shook slightly as he gripped the door. "Ethan," Frank said, his voice low and gravelly, as if the name hadn't passed his lips in years. "Dad?" Ethan replied, his own voice betraying the mix of emotions he felt. Anger, sadness, and something else he couldn't quite place. There was an awkward pause before Frank stepped aside to let Ethan in. The house smelled of dust and old memories. The walls were covered in photos, some of Ethan and Jack as kids, some of Frank's old boxing days. It was like walking into a museum of their past, frozen in time, a past Ethan wasn't sure he wanted to remember. "How's Jack?" Ethan asked after a long silence, though he wasn't sure he really wanted to know the answer. Frank shrugged, his shoulders heavy with the weight of years. "He's teaching now, at the high school." Ethan nodded, though it felt strange to think of Jack as a teacher. The Jack he remembered was a fighter, someone who never backed down from a challenge. But that was years ago, before the arguments, before the silence that had grown between them. "I guess he doesn't come around much," Ethan said, more of a statement than a question. Frank sighed and sat down in his old armchair. "No, he doesn't. Not anymore." The room fell into another uncomfortable silence. Ethan looked around, noticing the empty spaces where things used to be. The trophies were gone. The boxing gloves that had once hung on the wall were missing. The house felt empty, not just of things, but of the life it used to have. Frank cleared his throat, breaking the silence. "Why'd you come back, Ethan?" Ethan stared at the floor for a moment before answering. I just needed to come back." Frank didn't press further. They both knew there was more to it than that, but years of unresolved conflict made talking about anything real feel impossible. "I thought about calling you, Frank said after a while, his voice softer now. "But I didn't know what to say. It's been too long." Ethan nodded. "Yeah, it has." The truth was, Ethan wasn't sure what he was doing here either. The house, his father, it all felt so distant, like a life he had left behind long ago. But something had pulled him back. Maybe it was the feeling of unfinished business, or maybe it was the fact that no matter how far he ran, he couldn't escape his past. As they sat in silence, Ethan couldn't help but think of Jack. His brother had chosen a different path, one that didn't involve fighting, at least not in the ring. But Ethan knew they were both still fighting their own battles, just in different ways. "I'll stay for a few days," Ethan finally said. "If that's okay." Frank nodded, though there was something in his eyes, something like hope mixed with regret. "Yeah, son," he said quietly. You're welcome here." But even as Ethan put his bag down in the old guest room, he knew that the real fight hadn't even begun yet. Coming home was just the first round. There were still wounds to be healed, old battles to face, and a brother he hadn't spoken to in years. As he lay down on the old creaky bed, Ethan stared at the ceiling, his mind filled with memories of the past and the uncertainty of what lay ahead. He wasn't sure if he and Jack could ever fix what had been broken, but for now at least, he was home. And maybe that was a start. Jack sat at his small kitchen table, staring at the stack of bills in front of him. The early morning light filtered through the curtains, casting a soft glow on the otherwise bleak scene. His hands rested on his temples as he tried to make sense of the numbers: rent, utilities, car payments, and the most pressing, the overdue mortgage. The final notice lay on top of the pile, glaring up at him like a reminder of the life he could lose. He rubbed his eyes and glanced over at the clock. In less than an hour, he'd have to get ready for work. Another day at the high school, teaching history to students who barely cared. Teaching had been Jack's refuge after he'd walked away from the world of boxing. It was a quieter life, a stable one, or at least it had been until the school announced budget cuts. Jack's heart sank as he remembered the conversation with the principal a few weeks ago. He had been one of the first to be informed. They were letting go of several teachers, and his name was on the list. He had been given 2 months to find a new job, but in this town, jobs were hard to come by, especially for someone like Jack, whose resume was more about the fights he had won in the ring than the classes he had taught in the classroom. "Dad?" A small voice broke Jack's thoughts. He looked up to see his daughter, Emma, standing in the doorway, her blonde hair messy from sleep. She clutched her stuffed bunny, her eyes still heavy with dreams. "Hey, sweetheart," Jack said, forcing a smile. "You're up early." "I'm hungry," Emma said, her voice soft and sleepy. Jack stood and walked over to the fridge, opening it to reveal its near emptiness. He sighed quietly. There was just enough milk left for a small bowl of cereal. He poured it out for her, watching as she climbed onto a chair, still holding her bunny close. As Emma ate, Jack couldn't stop thinking about the looming eviction notice. They were already behind on payments, and now with the job loss, there was no way he could keep the house. He had tried to stay positive, telling himself he would find a solution, but the reality was crashing down hard. Jack sat back down, his mind spinning. He knew there was one way he could get the money, but it was something he had sworn he'd never do again. His body ached just thinking about it, the years of boxing taking their toll on his joints. Yet desperate times called for desperate measures. The local boxing competition was only a few weeks away, and the prize money was enough to cover the mortgage for a year. It was a risky move. He hadn't fought in years. But what other choice did he have? Losing the house would mean losing the only stability Emma had left, and that wasn't an option. Later that afternoon, Jack drove to the school, trying to push thoughts of the competition out of his mind. The halls were quiet when he arrived, the students not yet in class. As he sat at his desk, he flipped through the lesson plan for the day, but his mind wasn't on history. It was on the fight, on the possibility of stepping back into the ring. Jack's phone buzzed on his desk, pulling him out of his thoughts. It was a text message from his old friend Kyle, a fellow teacher at the school. "Did you hear? More cuts are coming next month. Stay strong, buddy." Jack sighed and tossed the phone back on his desk. Another reminder that time was running out. Meanwhile, across town, Ethan was sitting at the small kitchen table in Frank's house, sipping a cup of black coffee. The bitterness of the drink matched the bitterness of his thoughts. The conversation with Frank had been brief that morning, mostly awkward exchanges about training. Ethan knew he couldn't stay here long, but he didn't have anywhere else to go. His thoughts drifted to his old friend from the Army, Tom, who had recently been diagnosed with a serious illness. Medical bills had piled up for Tom, and he had reached out to Ethan for help. Ethan didn't have much to give, but he couldn't turn his back on a brother in arms. That's what made the local boxing competition tempting. The prize money could go a long way in helping Tom. Ethan had always been a fighter, whether in the military or before that, in the boxing ring under his father's tough training. But getting back into the ring now wasn't as easy as it used to be. His body had been through too much, and the memories of war haunted him at every turn. Still, the need for money was real, and helping Tom felt like a mission Ethan couldn't abandon. That afternoon, Ethan found himself in the old backyard, where Frank had set up a makeshift gym. The heavy bag hung from a tree branch, swaying gently in the breeze. Ethan stood in front of it, wrapping his hands with the same routine movements he had done countless times before. Frank watched from the porch, his arms crossed, saying nothing. Ethan threw a punch, the bag swinging back as he followed with a quick combination. His movements were sharp but lacked the fluidity they once had. His mind wandered, flashes of his time in the military interrupting his focus. "Your footwork's sloppy," Frank finally said, his voice gruff but not unkind. Ethan stopped, turning toward his father with a scowl. "Yeah, well, I'm not 18 anymore." Frank came down from the porch, hands in his pockets. "Age doesn't matter if you've still got the heart for it. You're stronger than you think." Ethan shook his head, wiping the sweat from his brow. "I don't know if I'm strong enough for this anymore." Frank paused for a moment, as if considering his next words carefully. "You're here, aren't you?" "That's the first step." Ethan didn't respond. The tension between them was still thick, years of unsaid words hanging in the air. But for now, they both knew this training was about more than just boxing. It was about finding a way to face the past. Across town, Jack sat in his car outside the gym, staring at the sign for the boxing competition. The weight of his decision pressed down on him, but he knew there was no other way. With a deep breath, he stepped out of the car and walked toward the entrance, ready to sign up. Both brothers were preparing for the same fight, though neither of them knew it yet. The sound of fists hitting the heavy bag echoed through Frank's backyard. Ethan threw another punch, his knuckles connecting with the worn leather, sending it swinging back. His breath came in sharp bursts, his muscles tense, his mind a storm of memories he wished he could forget. Each punch he threw wasn't just at the bag, it was at everything. His time in the war, the guilt, the sleepless nights, and the feeling of being lost in a world that no longer made sense. Frank stood a few feet away, arms crossed, as he watched his son train. His expression was unreadable, but inside he was wrestling with the same frustration. Watching Ethan fight like this was like watching a ticking time bomb. Powerful, yes, but dangerous too. Frank knew anger was a powerful motivator in the ring, but it was also a weakness. And Ethan had more than his share of anger. "You're rushing your punches," Frank called out, his voice firm but measured. "Slow down. Focus." Ethan barely acknowledged him, throwing another rapid-fire combination, sweat dripping from his brow. His movements were quick, sharp but wild. It was clear he was running on pure emotion, not strategy. "Ethan," Frank said more forcefully, stepping closer. "You can't fight like this. You're not thinking." Ethan stopped, breathing heavily, his fists still clenched. He glared at the heavy bag as if it had done something to him, then turned to Frank, eyes burning with frustration. "What do you want me to do, huh? Just forget everything? Pretend like I'm fine?" Frank held his gaze, his own frustration bubbling beneath the surface. "I want you to fight smart, not angry. This isn't the war anymore. You can't let it control you." Ethan's jaw tightened, and for a moment it looked like he was going to say something, but he stopped himself. Instead, he turned back to the bag and threw another punch, harder this time, as if to prove a point. Frank sighed. This wasn't the first time they'd had this conversation, and it wouldn't be the last. He knew Ethan needed to work through his anger, but he also knew that until Ethan could find peace with himself, the ring would only bring more pain. Frank wanted to help, but he wasn't sure how. Years of distance had created a gap between them that was hard to bridge. Across town, Jack was having his own struggles. His life had become a delicate balancing act, juggling work, family, and now training. After signing up for the competition, he had started going to the local gym in the evenings, sneaking in workouts between lesson plans and dinner with Emma. But it wasn't easy. At the gym, Jack wrapped his hands, staring at his reflection in the mirror. The man looking back at him was older than the one who used to fight in these rings. There were lines on his face now, a wariness in his eyes that hadn't been there before. He could still fight, but his body wasn't the same. His movements felt slower, more labored. Every punch, every round was a reminder of how much time had passed since he last stepped into the ring. Jack hit the speed bag, trying to find his rhythm, but his mind kept drifting. Between thoughts of the mortgage, his students, and Emma, he struggled to stay focused. The gym was noisy, filled with the sounds of other fighters training, the clang of weights, the sharp commands of trainers. It should have brought him back to his old mindset, but all it did was make him feel more out of place. His coach, Marcus, an old friend from his fighting days, watched him from the side. After a few minutes, Marcus stepped over, resting his hands on his hips. "You're not here, Jack," Marcus said, his voice calm but direct. Jack stopped, letting the speed bag slow to a stop. He wiped the sweat from his face and shrugged. "I'm trying, man. It's just a lot right now." Marcus nodded, understanding in his eyes. "I get it. But if you're serious about this, you need to be here, right now, not thinking about everything else." Jack sighed, leaning against the wall. "It's not that easy, Marcus. I've got Emma, the bills, and now this competition. I don't even know if I can win." Marcus shook his head. "You're not doing this to win. You're doing this because you have to. You've always been a fighter, Jack. You've got heart, and that's what counts in the ring. But you need to focus." Jack nodded, though the weight of everything still pressed down on him. He knew Marcus was right. If he didn't give it his all, he'd have no chance. But balancing everything felt impossible. That night, after training, Jack went home to find Emma asleep on the couch, her favorite movie still playing on the TV. He smiled softly, brushing a strand of hair from her face. She was his reason for everything, the only thing that made all of this worth it. Jack gently lifted her and carried her to her room, tucking her in before sitting down at the kitchen table once again. The stack of bills hadn't gotten any smaller. He ran his hands through his hair, exhausted, not just physically but mentally. As the days passed, both brothers continued their training, each driven by their own need for the prize money. For Ethan, the training sessions with Frank were becoming more intense. He pushed himself harder every day, his anger fueling every punch, every round. But the anger also made him reckless. Frank tried to rein him in, to get him to focus on technique and strategy, but Ethan wasn't listening. He was fighting a different battle, one that Frank couldn't see. Jack, on the other hand, was struggling to keep everything together. He trained late at night after grading papers and putting Emma to bed. His body was tired, his movements slower than they used to be, but he kept pushing. He had to. Every punch was for Emma, for their home, for the future he was fighting to keep. Neither brother knew the other was training for the same fight. But as they each worked through their own pain, old memories began to surface. Memories of their time growing up together, training in the backyard under Frank's watchful eye. Memories of the fights that had driven them apart. Ethan remembered the night he left, the argument with Jack that had torn their family in two. Jack had chosen a different path, one that didn't involve fighting, and Ethan had never forgiven him for it. Jack, on the other hand, remembered the pressure Frank had put on them, the constant push to be better, stronger. He had walked away because he couldn't handle the weight of it anymore. Now, as they both prepared for the same competition, those old wounds began to resurface. The fight ahead wasn't just in the ring, it was in their hearts, and neither of them was sure if they were ready to face it. The boxing gym was packed with spectators, the air electric with anticipation. The town hadn't seen this kind of excitement in years, and it seemed like everyone had come to witness the event. The local boxing tournament had always drawn a crowd, but this year there was an extra buzz in the air. Word had spread quickly. Two brothers, both former fighters, had entered the competition. No one knew the full story, but the whispers about Ethan and Jack had turned the tournament into something more than just a series of fights. It was personal. Ethan stood in the locker room, wrapping his hands with a methodical precision. His face was a mask of focus, cold and unshaken. He had won his first two matches without breaking much of a sweat. His opponents had been no match for him. He had cut through them with brutal efficiency, his punches landing with a force that left no doubt. Each victory brought him closer to the final. But for Ethan, this wasn't about the glory. It wasn't about the crowd or even the prize money anymore. It was about proving something to himself, though he wasn't sure what. As he finished wrapping his hands, Frank appeared in the doorway, his face lined with concern. He had been watching Ethan fight, but something about his son's cold demeanor worried him. Ethan wasn't fighting like he used to, with passion or precision. He was fighting like a man possessed, driven by anger and something darker. "Ethan," Frank said, his voice low but firm, "you need to slow down out there. You're going too hard, too fast. This isn't just about winning." Ethan looked up, his eyes hard. "Then what is it about?" Frank hesitated, choosing his words carefully. "It's about control. You're fighting with anger, and that's going to get you hurt." Ethan stood up, towering over his father. "I'm not going to get hurt. I'm going to win," Frank sighed. "Winning isn't everything, son." Ethan didn't respond. He didn't need to. For him, this competition was about more than just the prize money. It was a way to channel everything he had bottled up inside. Every punch, every victory was a release. He couldn't stop now, not when he was this close. On the other side of the gym, Jack was lacing up his gloves, his heart racing with both excitement and nerves. He had won his first 2 matches as well, though his victories hadn't come as easily as Ethan's. Jack had fought with grit and determination, every round a test of his endurance. His opponents had been strong, younger than him, faster, but Jack had something they didn't: heart. His coach Marcus stood beside him, offering words of encouragement. "You're doing great, Jack. Keep fighting smart, and you'll make it to the final." Jack nodded, though his thoughts were elsewhere. He had heard the rumors about Ethan, about how cold and unstoppable he looked in the ring. Jack hadn't seen his brother fight, but he had felt Ethan's presence looming over the competition. The idea of facing him in the final filled Jack with a mixture of dread and resolve. This wasn't just about the tournament anymore. It was about their relationship, the years of silence and unresolved tension between them. As he stood up to head toward the ring, Marcus gave him a firm pat on the back. "Remember why you're here, Jack. Fight for your family, for Emma. Don't let the past get in the way." Jack nodded again, his face set with determination. He was doing this for his family, for his daughter, and for himself. He couldn't afford to let anything else distract him. The competition moved forward with a steady rhythm, match after match drawing the crowd deeper into the intensity of the tournament. Ethan's next fight was against a seasoned fighter, known for his technical skill and footwork. But none of that mattered. Ethan came out swinging hard and fast, overwhelming his opponent within the first round. His punches were brutal, each one landing with precision and power. The crowd roared as Ethan knocked his opponent to the ground, securing his spot in the final. But Ethan didn't smile or celebrate. He didn't even acknowledge the crowd. He just turned and walked back to the locker room, his expression cold as ever. Jack's third fight was much tougher. His opponent was a young, hungry fighter, quick on his feet and eager to make a name for himself. The first round was brutal, with Jack taking several hard hits, but he stayed on his feet, his mind focused on his goal. As the fight wore on, Jack's experience began to show. He weathered the storm, dodging and countering with precision. By the third round, the younger fighter was starting to tire, and Jack saw his opening. With a combination of punches that came from years of practice, Jack landed a hard right hook that sent his opponent stumbling. The referee counted him out, and just like that, Jack had won his spot in the final. The crowd erupted in applause, but for Jack, the victory was bittersweet. He had made it to the final, but he knew who was waiting for him there: Ethan. The idea of fighting his brother didn't feel like a celebration. It felt like a reckoning. The town had begun to buzz with excitement. The idea of the two brothers facing off becoming the talk of every conversation. But for Jack, it was something far more personal. Later that night, back in the quiet of Frank's house, Ethan sat alone at the kitchen table, staring down at his hands. His knuckles were bruised and raw, the skin torn from his last fight. But it wasn't the pain in his hands that troubled him. It was the growing knot in his chest. He had made it to the final, but the closer he got, the more he realized what was waiting for him there. Jack. Ethan hadn't spoken to Jack since he had left for the military. They had exchanged angry words the night before he left, words that had cut deep. Ethan had never forgiven Jack for turning his back on their father, on boxing, on the life they had shared. But now, here they were, both standing on the same path, heading toward a collision that had been years in the making. Across town, Jack sat on his couch, Emma asleep in her room, the weight of the upcoming fight pressing down on him. He had always known that facing Ethan again would be hard, but he hadn't realized just how much it would hurt. Jack loved his brother, but they had grown so far apart that he wasn't sure if there was anything left to salvage between them. The town was buzzing with excitement. People speculated about the outcome of the fight. Some said Ethan would dominate, others believed Jack's heart and determination would win the day. But for the two brothers, the fight wasn't about winning or losing. It was about years of unresolved pain, about family, about all the things they had never said to each other. As the final match approached, both Ethan and Jack prepared for the fight of their lives, knowing that no matter the outcome, nothing would ever be the same again. For the town, it was a spectacle. For the brothers, it was a reckoning. The arena was filled with the roar of the crowd, the buzz of excitement almost deafening. Lights flashed overhead, casting a spotlight on the ring in the center, where two brothers were about to face each other for the first time in years. The announcer's voice echoed through the gym, but neither Jack nor Ethan paid him any attention. Their focus was locked on each other. Ethan stood in one corner, his body taut and ready. His eyes were cold, his expression unreadable, but inside his heart raced. Across the ring, Jack leaned against the ropes, breathing deeply as he tried to calm the storm of emotions swirling inside him. The gym felt too small, too loud, as if the weight of the years of silence between them was pressing down on both of their chests. The bell rang sharp and clear, signaling the start of the fight. The brothers stepped forward, circling each other cautiously, testing the waters. The crowd erupted in cheers, but the noise faded into the background. For Ethan and Jack, the world shrank to just the two of them, and the unspoken tension that had built over the years hung in the air between them. Ethan was the first to move, throwing a quick jab that Jack dodged with ease. He followed up with a left hook, but Jack saw it coming and stepped back. The first round was cautious, both brothers dancing around each other, trying to find their rhythm. But it didn't take long for the fight to turn personal. Ethan's next punch landed hard, a sharp right to Jack's ribs, making him stumble. Jack recovered quickly, but the blow was a reminder of the power Ethan held, both physically and emotionally. Jack countered with a jab, then another, landing a solid hit to Ethan's jaw. But instead of backing down, Ethan pressed forward, his fists flying with a fury that spoke of years of unresolved anger. The brothers exchanged blows, each hit heavy with more than just physical force. It was the weight of their past, the arguments, the misunderstandings, and the silence between them. Every punch seemed to bring a memory to the surface, old wounds reopening with each strike. "Why'd you leave, Jack?" Ethan spat between breaths, his fists landing hard on Jack's body. Jack ducked under a punch, sweat pouring down his face. "I didn't leave. You're the one who walked away." Ethan's fists flew faster, his anger rising. "You turned your back on everything. On Dad, on me. You quit." Jack took a step back, his arms up in defense. "I had to. You don't understand. I couldn't live like that anymore." The punches came faster now, their movements less controlled, more emotional. The crowd cheered, but neither brother heard them. For them, this was more than a fight. It was a conversation they had been avoiding for years, and each punch was a word they hadn't been able to say. Ethan's anger burned bright, his fists relentless. But as the rounds went on, something began to shift. Jack wasn't fighting with anger. He wasn't here to win. His punches were controlled, deliberate, but not fueled by rage. He was fighting for something else, something deeper. As the fight dragged into the later rounds, both brothers began to tire. Their movements slowed, their punches less precise, but the emotions between them still ran high. Ethan landed a hard hit to Jack's jaw, sending him stumbling back into the ropes. For a moment, it looked like it was over, but Jack caught himself, breathing heavily as he stood back up, his eyes locking with Ethan's. "You think you're the only one who's hurting?" Jack shouted, his voice hoarse. "You're not, Ethan. We're all broken." Ethan paused, his fist still raised, his chest heaving. Jack's words hit harder than any punch. For the first time, the anger in Ethan's eyes wavered, replaced by something else. Pain, confusion, a hint of vulnerability. The next few moments felt like an eternity. Neither of them moved. The crowd fell silent, sensing something had shifted. Jack, bruised and exhausted, dropped his hands to his sides. "I never wanted to leave you, but I couldn't live in Dad's shadow anymore. I had to make my own life." Ethan stood there, breathing hard, his fists still clenched. He had spent so many years blaming Jack for everything, for the broken family, for the distance, for his own pain. But now, as he looked at his brother, tired and bleeding in front of him, something in him softened. "I needed you," Ethan finally said, his voice quiet, almost lost in the noise of the gym. "I didn't know how to handle it without you." Jack nodded, his face a mixture of regret and understanding. I know, Ethan. I'm sorry. For a moment, the fight seemed to pause. The brothers stood there, no longer adversaries, but two men who had finally begun to understand each other's pain. Ethan's fist dropped to his sides, his body sagging with exhaustion, both physical and emotional. He took a step back, then another, before turning his back to Jack and walking toward the center of the ring. The referee looked between the two men, unsure of what was happening. But the fight was over. It wasn't about winning anymore. Jack followed, his breathing shallow, his face bruised but resolute. The crowd, sensing the emotional weight of the moment, fell into a hushed silence as the brothers stood side by side in the middle of the ring. The bell rang again, signaling the end of the fight. But neither of them cared about the official result. The real victory had already been won. Ethan turned to Jack, his face softening for the first time in years. We need to fix this. Jack nodded. Yeah, we do. And with that, the two brothers, battered and bruised but no longer enemies, walked out of the ring together. The noise of the crowd faded into the background as they stepped into the tunnel, leaving the fight behind them, ready to start rebuilding what had been broken for so long. For the first time in years, they weren't just brothers in name. They were brothers again.